Now we are pleased to introduce our first panel of the day, titled, What is China Doing in Science? Moderating this discussion will be Libby Lange, Director of Intelligence at SCSP. Please welcome our panelists. Mike Kuiken, Commissioner on the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. Kendra Schaefer, Director of Tech Policy Research at Trivium China. And David Lin, Senior Director for Future Technology Platforms at SCSP.
All right, everyone. Well, thank you all for being here for our first panel discussion at the AI Plus Science Summit. I'm very fortunate today to be joined by my three panelists. As just mentioned, Mike Kuiken is a commissioner on the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. Kendra Schaefer is a partner at Trivium China. And David Lin is the Senior Director for Future Tech Platforms at SCSP. And so I think that this is a very fitting kind of first panel to start us out with this summit, because as we're thinking about science and research through this competitive lens, I think it's helpful to sort of first draw out the playing field of, who we're competing with and then sort of how to compete. How are they competing with us? I think to help us better inform the policies that we make in response. And so I thought, Mike, we could actually start with you in sort of laying out that 30,000-foot strategic lens. How do you see science and research fitting into China's national strategy? How does it fit into their idea of national power?
Thanks for the question. Thanks for having me here today. The way I sort of think about this is that the Chinese basically have watched the United States since the end of World War II, where we deployed the sort of pursuit of the endless frontier that Vannevar Bush created. And they are building the sort of industrial scale effort to make sure that they can flood the zone, boil the ocean, however you want to sort of think about it, on R&D. And the reason they've done this is they sort of watched how over the course of the 80 plus years since World War II, that the United States used research and development, the sort of foundational research, to sort of be the feedstock for starting the flywheel of innovation, scaling things, and bringing them to market, whether that was on the sort of on the civilian side or on the military side. And that's sort of how I've sort of observed this over the last decade or so. That's how I sort of frame up a lot of the things that we do on the Commission. I'm obviously not here in that capacity today, but that's how I sort of think about it.
And so it's interesting that you mentioned sort of science as an engine to bringing things to market. Actually, David, I would love to follow up with you on that, because one thing that we've seen PRC leadership really double down on, even at the levels of Xi Jinping himself, is on basic research. So these kind of fundamental questions of how the world works that maybe don't have immediate commercial applications. And so I kind of have a two-part question. The first being, why basic research? And the second being, what are the hurdles that China has to actually achieving that capability?
Yeah, thanks, Libby. In the China community, people always say you don't need to read between the lines or read the tea leaves, because China always signals exactly what they're thinking and where they want to take things. And so along the lines of basic research, Xi Jinping himself has said time and time again, as recently as June last year, at his S&T conference, that basic research is a key area where China is behind, full stop. Just a couple months ago, on the front page of People's Daily, Ren Zhengfei, the CEO of Huawei, which has become a household term, a household name these days, also said that China will always be behind until they can accelerate and excel at basic research. So Chinese leaders have repeatedly said that basic research is the missing key to their innovation ecosystem. One of the areas where, so there are a lot of obstacles to why this has been a problematic gap for China over the years. There's this friction between CCP ideology and trying to promote innovation at the grassroots level, and the overriding control that the CCP wants to assert. But there's also almost deeper issues here, in the sense that the party always wants to maintain control, and the party has been struggling to create an ecosystem. More recently, they just stood up the Central S&T Commission as a way to assert stronger party control. But just getting organized has been a key strength and a key vulnerability for Beijing in the space in particular.
So.
And so you're saying that this has been a priority for some number of years now. Have you seen meaningful progress thus far, or is the continued signaling a sign that it's not really going anywhere?
I mean, Beijing year over year now, I think for the past several years is spending, I think, close to 8 or 9% increases in R&D spending year over year. So that is a clear sign that they're trying to ramp up in this space. I know we might get into this later, but Beijing is great at building infrastructure. And so they are pouring billions of dollars of government dollars into building big national labs, big infrastructure projects, big scientific and technological R&D facilities for their researchers, both to and strengthen their domestic researchers, but also attract foreign talent into the country to set up shop and do scientific research.
Yeah, so I will definitely come back to you on that physical infrastructure question. But first I wanted to ask you, Kendra, you know this wouldn't be an SCSP event if we didn't have a conversation about AI. And so in terms of kind of the AI of all of this, are you starting to see AI factoring into China's scientific strategies where they are calling for AI to be used in scientific discovery? Are you seeing concrete steps towards that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the state doesn't really define exactly how it wants to see that happen. There's definitely a lot of top-line strategy encouraging increasing access for researchers to scientific infrastructure so that they can do AI research, calls to incorporate AI into the research ecosystem. But that's a broad 3,000-foot view. We can actually get much more granular than that and specify exactly how those research institutions are using AI. And one of the ways we're able to do that is that China's cyberspace authority, the Cyberspace Administration of China, requires that all generative AI tools that are public-facing be registered with the state. And because of that requirement, and that registration data is public, and because of that requirement, we're able to actually have what essentially amounts to a definitive list of the at least public-facing AI tools that these research institutions are launching. So we have a fascinating and quite granular view of what some of those efforts actually are. We see a lot of state-backed laboratories utilizing their access to supercomputing infrastructure to build foundational tools. I'm sorry, is my mic a little messed up?
I think, yeah, if you just move it there, that'd be perfect.
Okay, how's that?
There.
Okay. Building foundational tools that allow, commercial companies obviously wouldn't be incentivized to do. So Zhejiang Laboratory, for example, is building GeoGPT, which is a geoscience tool. You've got Tianmushan Laboratory building a materials science tool. And Pengsheng Laboratory is building a sort of foundational LLM. So some really interesting projects from state laboratories. We're also seeing state-backed companies, companies that have received state funding, try to tackle US-China tech competition issues using AI. So for example, there's a couple of state-funded companies that are doing semiconductor design generation tools, right? So sort of an interesting and broad adoption of AI to solve, for science, but also to sort of solve these US-China competition issues.
And do you see?
Do you mind if I?
Oh, of course.
There's something David said and something Kendra said I just want to really hit on. One, David mentioned the sort of growth in investment in China in science and technology, 8 to 9% a year, I think he said. That's called a trend line. Everyone in DC wants to give you a hot take or a snapshot of what's happening in the moment. Let me tell you, that's the wrong way to look at this. The trend line right now is that China is making gigantic investments in science and technology. This is all to get to the flywheel that I sort of talked about. At the same time, we're seeing flat funding or decreases in the American investment in science. This is an incredibly disturbing trend and something that everyone here should keep an eye on and raise the alarm about. The American innovation system is incredible. It needs money, and it needs consistent funding, it needs reliable funding, and it needs to make sure the trend line is going in the right direction. So that's the first thing I wanted to hit on. The second thing, on AI. One of the things we're seeing in China that I thought Kendra was going to hit on is their interest in open source AI development. So let's think about this. This is basically like an operating system for a computer at some level. Who wrote Linux? It's an American operating system. Who is writing the open source ecosystem for AI, China is. Obviously, we have Hugging Face and some important investments in Meta, but like the bedrock of this is becoming a Chinese large language model that is coded not by Americans, but in China. And so as we think about closed models versus open models, one of the things we need to think about is how should the US government think about open source models? How do we make sure we're learning from them? How do we make sure that we're sort of continuing to play an important role in that ecosystem? Sorry, Libby.
No. I mean, great addition. And actually, I would love to follow up on that from your national security lens. When you're thinking of this trend line of increasing investment, what are some areas that you think, if they were to make a breakthrough in, that it would kind of fundamentally change the competition between the US and China in science?
I mean, Illy's going to laugh at me on the first one because he knows I say this all the time, but biotech, I believe, is an incredible opportunity. When I worked on the Hill, if you utter the word biotech, everyone would say, no, we don't want to do pharma. And my point was always like, biotech has so much opportunity beyond pharma, and we're not talking about it, which is biomanufacturing, chemical replacements, construction materials, all kinds of opportunity here. I got this bumper sticker recently from one of my Hoover colleagues. It was, what would Shenzhen do? And the reason he gave it to me was because the biotech community is moving to Shenzhen. The opportunities there are incredible. The labs, going back to the infrastructure point, are incredible. And they are doing sort of industrial scale innovation in biotech. That's the first one. The second spot is quantum. The commission recently did a trip out west to visit with a bunch of the sort of premier labs and companies in the quantum space. China is absolutely racing in quantum. I am convinced that there's more going on in the quantum ecosystem in China than we realize, and it's an area where the US has made some important investments, but not nearly enough.
And so do you think there are areas where our priorities are out of step, fields where they're really focused and we're not quite as focused?
I think they're incredibly focused on biotech, like I mentioned. I think they're incredibly focused on quantum, more than we realize and appreciate. And the third thing, and I've really learned this as part of my work with SCSP, is fusion. Fusion is another area where the Chinese are making incredible investments, and I think we just saw something on social media today about a $2.1 billion facility that just opened up in fusion. So I think it's an area where we're sort of trying to still figure out how we get our hands around it and where to fund and where to invest, and we're just not there yet. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. I guess, the couple of fields you mentioned, interestingly, all have a real data nexus, right? Those are all incredibly data-heavy fields. You need access to tons of data to make progress. I'm thinking specifically of biotechnology. You need a lot of sensitive data. Kendra, I would love to ask you, we know that China is great at collecting data, but I guess maybe we know less about how they kind of make it available to the wider ecosystem, both government researchers, private sector. Are you seeing that playing out in science?
Yes, I am to a certain degree. I think so. You're right. China has a bunch of advantages when it comes to data, and the key advantage that China has on data is its ability to centralize data. Part of that is just due to the structure of the state. You've got a very sort of pyramid style state structure through which lower level entities, hospitals, for example, might collect health data, and that eventually sort of gets funneled up the chain into a centralized database. But it's also its other advantage is that the state really focuses and prioritizes digitization and digital standards in data formatting across the country. And so, again, health records are a wonderful example of that. About 10 years ago, China launched a big campaign to release technical standards on health records, essentially requiring hospitals and clinics to save their data in a way that's interoperable, which seems like such a boring development at the time. Like, who cares about medical record data structure standardization? But you get 10 years later, 15 years later, what you have is data that can be grabbed in mass by researchers and then applied to, AI. So that pairing of centralization plus, standardization ends up being a big benefit for China. Where one of its major disadvantages are in the over-securitization of protecting access to data. Autonomous vehicles is a wonderful example of this. China's Ministry of Natural Resources is the body responsible for mapping. And when autonomous vehicle companies wanted to get into the market, right, they have to drive around and collect, geographic data on their own from their sensors and cameras, and they ran right into a regulatory fight with M&R, who is very security-minded and very focused on sort of protecting that mapping data. Now they've come up with a scheme where M&R licenses those companies. You can get a license to collect mapping data, but only 19 companies in China have it, and you have to go through a very onerous process. So that creates a sort of block where you want to get into autonomous vehicles, you have to go through M&R or partner with a company that already has this M&R license, which is a pain in the butt. So, over-securitization on the one side is a problem for science and R&D. On the other side, these massive data sets that have sort of better standard foundations are useful for scientists and large-scale AI projects.
So maybe a question for you or the floor, whoever would like to take it, is how do we compete on the data front, without having our government collect tons and tons of data in the way that China does? How can we compete?
I mean, one way is just to preserve America's leadership and as the go-to destination for basic research, or research writ large, right? China's certainly seeking to exploit any perceived weaknesses or gaps in funding or ways to attract talent in the US. We've seen in the past few months, the FBI also put out a counterintelligence notice that the Chinese were putting out fake job boards and fake job notices as a way to recruit researchers or even former government employees in the US to come to China to do their work there. Speaking of Shenzhen, there was something floating around the internet about how Shenzhen has put out, the home of Huawei and Tencent and a lot of other big Chinese tech companies had put out an ad in English explicitly recruiting researchers who had been laid off from government labs and all the rest of it. And so just holding on to this ecosystem that China is very envious of and has modeled itself after is really the key first basic step, I think.
Well, I'll also jump in and answer the data portion of that. Something that's really interesting is you probably read somewhere that AI competitiveness has 3 components. One of those is chips. The other one is talent, and then you also have data. Well, whether you agree with it or not, we have a strategy on chips, and sort of have a strategy on talent, but we really don't have a national strategy on leveraging the power of data for economic gain and scientific progress, right? And in fact, several of the projects that are designed to support the scientific research community, the NAIR project some of you may have heard of, for example, are inadequately funded. And so, it sounds so obvious to say, but more money for scientists and their access to data and infrastructure, I think, is critical.
On data, there was this buried inside of the 800-page China Commission report last year, was this section where we talked about China actually authorizing local governments to put data as an asset on their balance sheet. So that just helps you understand how China thinks about data and recognizes that it is in fact an asset and something that you could put on your balance sheet. It's obviously the flywheel that Kendra just mentioned for AI. So on data, I actually don't think that the government needs more money to do data. I actually think what the government needs to do is an enterprise approach on data, which is stop hiring all these random companies to do your data, whether it's sort of sorted data or unsorted data, the proper name I'm forgetting. But that's really where we need to go. The United States government, if you ask ChatGPT, is the largest holder of data in the world, which is extraordinary if you truly think about it. There's historic data that's probably still on paper. There's obviously all kinds of electronic data that's available. And we haven't even, from a government perspective, said, holy cow, we're going to leverage this data like it should be, the asset that it is to the American government and ultimately to the American people. And that's something we should be thinking about when we sort of think about how do we take the data that's in the government's holdings and make it accessible where appropriate for industry. And there's obviously a ton of classified data. How do we leverage that classified data to make sure that our analysts, whether at the NSA or CIA or someplace else, are able to do their work better, and to sort of look at things through a historic lens and to see those trends that we might otherwise miss?
Well, if I can add to that as well, he mentioned a very important point, which is that the state is incentivizing government bodies to share data. We've tried to do that too, and we failed at it. And China tried to do that too, and they failed at it. And the reason is because there was no good incentive for a government body to spend a bunch of time and money and resources and effort collecting all the data that they have and making it available to the public due to some kind of kumbaya open data, why, right? And what China has done instead in the last year is that they have authorized local governments not just to put data on their balance sheet, but to make profit off of the data they sell. And so they've given local governments a way to generate more revenue by collecting data. Now, this has only happened in the last 12 months, and so we don't know whether it works or not. But that's an incentive mechanism that I imagine will probably be very attractive and an actual reason for government bodies, large data holders, to collect that data, standardize it, and make it available to innovators.
The funny thing is, none of what Kendra just said is novel. If you ever Google data brokers and your name, it is wild what comes out. And guess what data brokers have been doing? Monetizing your data. It is an asset, and we do not leverage it at the government level, and China is actively pursuing opportunities to leverage the data, both from the science perspective, also, as Kendra mentioned, to monetize.
Yeah, I would never endorse Googling yourself. Always a weird experience. But David, I actually want to return kind of on this question of assets. Moving from the digital back to the physical, to something you said earlier when it comes to China's ability to build out physical infrastructure. Maybe we don't think about this in connection with science as much, but I think you made a good point about how you do need physical spaces to do science. So could you maybe just dig a little more into what that's looking like on the ground, like what fields that's really impacting and what we could maybe be doing more?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's a heavy infrastructure component to scientific R&D, right? You need the compute and you need the connectivity. And those are two infrastructure aspects that China, I don't think, in those regards, is afraid of overcapacity. We've seen time and time again China building more 5G base stations that it needs, building more data centers that it needs, with the expectation that the demand come after the fact. That, of course, is contrary to the way liberal democracies, market-driven economies work, where you build the supply to meet the demand. But by that point, oftentimes the supply or the demand is outweighing the supply in that model. In the China model, they're not afraid of building it first and crossing their fingers and hoping they come to use it. And so we're seeing that to be the case with 5G, 6G infrastructure. We're seeing that to be the case with data centers in China right now. Flipping that to the US context, those are some of the major bottlenecks that researchers are experiencing here in the US. And so that's an interesting comparison to draw between the two approaches to infrastructure.
You're saying infrastructure? On infrastructure, let me tell you, I used to work for Majority Leader Schumer, and one of the coolest opportunities I got was sort of traveling around the country to visit the infrastructure that the US has built over the last 80 years. And I don't know if anyone's heard of the NIF or SLAC or HEAF. There's all these wild acronyms, but there's infrastructure across this country that has been built over the preceding decades. The thing that hasn't happened is we've not modernized these facilities. We have not hit the refresh key. We haven't made sort of a once-in-a-generation investment in building new facilities. There was some investment after 9/11 that you see. The HEAF, for example, was built after 9/11. I can't remember which national lab it's at. It's the High Explosive Something facility. It's an amazing facility. And my point is that we have not invested in infrastructure in a sort of systematic manner, focused on sort of key technological areas to sort of advance American innovation in these spaces. And it's a real shame. And as we look and watch the facilities in China, we should assume that all of our researchers are looking enviously into China, thinking, well, maybe I should go to China. That is the wrong scenario to have. And so that's getting back to the sort of trend line issue. That's a trend that needs to be addressed and reversed.
All right, anything to add, Kendra? No? All right. I guess moving into sort of the final big topic before we enter our lightning round, I think maybe the wild card in all of this when it comes to science is talent, right? The US, for many, many years has been the place where global talent comes to do great science. But I think that, the world is in a challenging moment when it comes to science, and I think there's, a lot changing quickly, and I'm curious sort of how China is seeking to leverage this moment when it comes to talent. Are they coming up with new incentives to bring global science talent in? Are they, trying new methods to keep their homegrown talent in China? What are we seeing on that front?
So that's actually pretty interesting. I know a lot of our focus is on China's efforts to bring in foreign talent, but actually, when we look at China's talent policy, what we see is that China's largest concern isn't we want to suck up all the foreign scientists, it is we have 1.4 billion people here and we do not leverage our own resources well at all. Our talent resources are stymied by the institutions in which they exist and under some of the rules under which they labor and just the general innovation ecosystem. And so the state has kind of launched this big reform effort to try to fix various aspects of the innovation ecosystem that keep young talent down, right? And that keep talent and companies siloed from each other, that keep researchers and companies, right, in different rooms. So one of the major interesting problems is just that there's a lot of entrenched cronyism in the scientific institutions. And you get older researchers who've been around for 40 years, who are sort of resting on their laurels, who have a lot of power in scientific institutions, who just publish a lot of volume of papers, but maybe those papers aren't very innovative, and it's difficult for sort of younger scientists to climb this ladder. So we have started seeing, efforts to switch reward systems from number of papers published to quality of papers published, to how many patents have you commercialized, right? And to kind of incentivize younger researchers to really get in the to climb the ladder, and then also, but not just to stay in academia, to take their findings and to go out and make commercial products with those findings. So, it's not just utilizing the skills that China has isn't just happening on the talent front either. We also see that in efforts by the state to do things like they just ordered universities to go through all of their past patent pools, blow the dust off of them, and identify patents that have been wasted and sitting in a library somewhere that didn't ever have the opportunity to shine, but maybe that's a wonderful commercializable product now, 10 years later or something after the patent was filed. So it's really about using the resources that China has, including the talent resources, to better effect than it is necessarily about, pulling it. Of course they would love to attract global talent. Everybody wants to attract global talent. But if you look at China's visa schemes, even for top-tier talent, they're not that great. Some of those incentives are okay, but not that great. Sometimes financial packages are very hefty, but that still isn't 100% of the, obviously a financial package or access to infrastructure, is very attractive, but it's only one piece of the puzzle. So the state's really trying to just squeeze more juice out of what it has domestically.
I know you want to lightning round us, but the one thing I would just say is, at some point we devalued vocational education, and there is an entire vocational layer here that China is investing in and that we are not investing in. I was recently at UCLA, and one of the things that they created was a master's degree in quantum, and the reason they did that was you obviously need incredibly talented quantum researchers. There's also a layer below there that you need to sort of operationalize that research and make sure it's successful. That's also an area where we need to be thinking about, and where China is making investments. And then the other thing I would say is, no one should forget that there are 25 or 30 master welders in the Navy industrial base these days. In order, if we're going to build ships, we need welders, or we need to develop robots that can do the welding. But then we are going to need vocational workers to make sure we can take care of the robots. So there's an entire piece of this in the workforce space which we've not sort of thought strategically about. And as you watch what's happening in China, Kendra mentioned the 1.3 or 1.4 billion people, there's an investment on each line of effort there that is happening in a very strategic and thoughtful way that we're not doing similarly. Sorry, Libby.
All right, no, that was great. I guess with our final 45 seconds, with our lightning round, I would love for each of you to just tell me what area of scientific research in our competition with China keeps you up at night and why. And we'll start with David.
Well, I guess a prevalent theme has been the infrastructure piece. And, so many times new ideas, novel technologies are invented here in the United States, but are scaled and deployed in China thanks to their ability to manufacture and deploy and scale. We've seen this with solar PVs. We've seen this with advanced batteries. I don't want to see this to be, the future technology to be named, to be invented here in the U.S., but then manufactured and deployed at scale in China. And so that's the key concern I think we have going forward.
For me, I think too much policymaker time and attention has been focused on playing a defensive game of identifying Chinese companies on a one-on-one basis and trying to play whack-a-mole, dealing with these threats from individual firms instead of focusing our effort and attention on running faster and answering some of these major questions that will support our own researchers to do what they do best of anyone in the world, which is innovate. And so, again, focusing on infrastructure, access, focusing on a data strategy, focusing on, supporting science, focusing on science education in K through 12, focusing on vocational education, all of those things in my mind are more important than identifying the next DeepSeek and, letting that suck all of the air out of the room.
You asked for sectors, didn't you?
Feel free.
I've already gone through my laundry list, which is biotech, fusion, quantum, and then the Commission's top recommendation, which Jacob Helberg and I worked on last year, was artificial general intelligence, which I know the President is going to talk about today. But I think that is an area where being the first mover is vital, and Kendra's point of running faster in that space is critical.
All right, well, that is a great laundry list. I hope all of that keeps you up at night. But join me in thanking all of our panelists.